Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. My name is Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're making block 1 of the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month quilt. This features Northcott fabric Stonehenge Gradations. They're really pretty. They kind of act as a near solid, so when you look at it from a distance, it kind of looks like one color, but as you get closer, you can see the subtle color variations of the fabrics. And it really is a beautiful, beautiful quilt. So today we're going to start off simple with some strip piecing. I told you this quilt was going to be easy, and you'll see as we go through today's first video. So I've got my strips lined up here that we're going to sew together. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my sewing machine up to sew a scant 1/4 inch stitch. Now you could just sew a regular 1/4 inch stitch with this pattern, but I like to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam whenever I'm sewing strips because that helps me be a little bit more accurate. So just do whatever works for you in order to have everything turn out the way it's supposed to. So in order to get the cutting instructions for this block, you're going to want to pick up your pattern book to go with this. It is available through local quilt shops. You may be able to get it there, or you can get it at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So I'm lining my first 2 strips up right sides together, and I'm just going to sew along with making sure that my presser foot is in line with the edge of that fabric. And if you're new to strip piecing, it really is pretty easy. All you need to do is line up your edges, and I don't worry about lining up and pinning the whole 2 strips together. I just get it as far as it will sit on my sewing machine throat. And then I go ahead and sew, making sure that my fabric is nice and in line with that edge. And I just kind of hold that in place with my fingers until I get to the point where I've sewn all that. Then I arrange it again and keep sewing. Alright, so I'm coming to the end of my first strip piece, and I have a second one to do over here. This pink and black needs to be sewn together. So I'm going to do something called chain piecing. This saves thread and time. So what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and sew all the way to the edge of your first strip piece unit. And go ahead and sew right off that. It won't hurt your machine to take a few stitches beyond. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my next strip piece sets. I'm going to arrange them right sides together, just like we did for the first one, and get those edges aligned. Now I'm just going to slide this right underneath my presser foot and keep sewing. And it's really pretty simple, so when this is done, you just snip the few threads that are in between the strips, and then you have 2 strip piece units ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this strip piece unit together the same way we did the last one. Then we're going to come back and show you how to cut these up. So before I cut these apart, I have to press them open. In this case, we're going to want to press so that the seam is underneath the dark side of the fabric, which is the black fabric in this case. So what I'm going to do is flip this over so that the purple is on the bottom and the black is on the top. I'm going to go ahead and set my seam, which just means I'm running the iron over that seam allowance a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and finger press this a little bit first, and that helps keep the seams from getting wavy, which can sometimes happen when you are doing a long strip set. So go ahead and continue doing this all the way down the length of both strip sets, and then we'll come back. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I pressed all of my strip sets so that the seam is underneath the dark side of the fabric. Now it's time to cut them up, and again, make sure you refer to your instructions in the pattern book, which you can get at your local quilt shop that carries Northcott fabrics, or at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to line this up so that I have an inch line of my ruler along that seam line. And this is the seam that we want to pay attention to, because if this is off, like if it's going like this is a pretty big exaggeration. But if we were to cut it like that, then the seams are not going to go together when we go to put together a 4-patch. So what you want to do is make sure that you have any inch line on your ruler lined up with that seam line, and then you want to make sure that in this case we're cutting it to 2.5 inches wide. So we want to make sure that we have some fabric extending beyond that, because this is the first cut of the strip set. So I'm just going to go ahead and make that cut, and then I need to square up our edge here. So now I'm paying attention to have it where my cut line is. My 2.5 inch mark is along this cut edge, and then my inch line is along that seam. So now I can cut, and I know that these are going to go together perfectly now when I go to do a 4-patch. So now that's just for the first one. For all the rest of them, it's pretty simple. All you do is you line up an inch line with the seam line. Make sure your 2.5 inch mark is along the edge you just cut. And then go ahead and slice that open. So go ahead and continue down both strip sets, cutting these into 2 patches. Now that we have these strip piece units cut apart, it's time to sew them together to make a 4 patch. What this does is it really speeds up our sewing, because instead of sewing all of these squares together individually, we're able to do it very quickly by strip piecing them together, then cutting them apart. So it saves quite a bit of time. So I'm just going to flip these right sides together. And I don't even pin these because the seams will butt up together real nicely because they're pressed in the opposite direction, but you certainly can pin them if you feel comfortable doing that. I'm making sure to set my sewing machine back to a 1/4 inch stitch because we want to make sure that we are sewing with an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And then I'm just going to go ahead and sew on down. I do pause a little bit when I come to that seam line, making sure that needle is really hitting that seam right in the right spot so that our join looks good. Then I'm going to go ahead and sew down the rest. You can save time and strip piece these as well by just putting the right sides together for the next one. And then when you line it up, you're just going to slide that right underneath the presser foot. I've sewn a few stitches off of my first one. And I'm just going to keep on sewing. Again, when I do this, I make sure that I'm good and lined up right where these joins come together. You can pin that if you want. And then I make sure that my corners are lined up at the bottom. And keep sewing. Now go ahead and keep sewing these 4 patches together until you have them all done for the first block. So we have one final step before our 4 patch is ready. We've got to go ahead and press that open. It really doesn't matter what side you press it to at this point. You just have to press that open. So now we have our 4 patch unit. It was really fast and easy because we used strip piecing and chain piecing to make this go quick. Alright, now it's time to sew together those picket fence units. We're going to do it in a way that minimizes waste. Let's get started. So you're going to want to make sure you refer to your pattern book so that you get the right fabrics and lay them out in the right orders. But what I've done is I've taken my black triangles here and I have flipped them over so that the wrong side is up. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line up 1/4 inch line with the edge of the long side of that triangle. And I'm going to take my chalk marking tool and I'm just going to mark that seam line. So we're going to sew right on this line for the next step. And you just want to choose something that shows up pretty well that you can see. I like these clover chalk wheels. They come in a lot of colors. Pink shows up pretty well for me. So now I'm going to lay these so that the tip of my line is even with the tip of my rectangle. And the tip of my line comes out even with the edge of this rectangle. I'm going to do the same thing with the yellow. And again, make sure you refer to your pattern book so that you are making sure that these are going in the right way. So when I sew these, what I like to do is set my sewing machine so that the needle is in the center. I find that's a little bit easier when I'm sewing on the line as opposed to next to when we do things like half square triangles. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to go ahead and put my presser foot down and I'm going to sew right on top of that line. And I really am taking my time with this. You could pin if you wanted to, but I really am just kind of taking it easy and going slow, making sure that I'm sewing on that line and that my triangle doesn't shift so that everything's going to turn out the way it's supposed to be. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the green one, and then we'll be ready for the next step. Now before we press these, we're going to want to make sure we cut off this extra triangle. And if you do it before you press it, then you are less likely to accidentally cut off the piece that we need to keep. So I always do that first before I press anything. Now there's a little trick to pressing these that'll make it easier to sew them together. For the yellow rectangle, I'm going to press it so that the seam is underneath that black triangle. And for the green, I'm going to press it so that the seam is underneath the green rectangle. So then when I put these together, my seams are going to butt up real nicely with each other. So I'm just going to flip these right sides together. And you can see that I have one seam going to the right and one seam going to the left. If you wanted, you could put a little pin in here. I'm not going to. I'm just going to go ahead and sew that together. So I'm putting my sewing machine back to a 1/4 inch stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and sew right down there. I got my points lined up at the top of the rectangle. And I'm going to sew and stop with my needle down once it's in that seam allowance. Then I go ahead and line up my bottom corners. And I kind of just pinch those in place with my finger and let it go through the sewing machine. Now the trick to really getting a really great join when you're doing picket fence units is to press the center seam open. We've pressed these seams up and down so that way they butt up next to each other really easily. But if you press this open, then it really makes for a really flat seam in the center, and then it also looks like it's just absolutely perfect. So that's my trick to getting really great seams when you have a picket fence unit. So from here on out, it's pretty simple. It's just like sewing together a standard 9-patch unit. It's really great because we don't really have any seams to match in this one, because even though we have a seam here, there aren't any here that we have to worry about. Same with the center block. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew this together into rows first, and then sew the rows into a completed block. Really, it's very simple from this point on. One thing I really like to do is lay everything back out to make sure that everything is going in the direction it's supposed to. I'm less likely that way to accidentally sew something in the wrong spot and have to rip, because nobody wants to do that. We just want to get our block done. Alright, so I have my first row together. I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of these into rows as well, and then we're going to come back and finish this block up. So I've got everything sewn into rows, and what makes it really easy to join is if we make sure that we're pressing these seams so that they're going in opposite directions. So the way I always just do it is I look at the path of least resistance. So obviously it's going to be really easy to press these seams so that they're going underneath this large square, because there's nothing on the square that's going to obstruct that. Same way with this one, it's going to be easier to press so that the seam is going underneath the 4-patch, because it's always easier to press to a nice straight seam than one of these curved ones. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and press the seam so that it's underneath this 4-patch on both sides. Like that. Now I'm going to press this next seam so that it goes underneath the square. Like this. So now when I'm going to put these together in a little bit, my seams are going in opposite directions. I've got the one seam going to the center, one seam going out. So that's going to make it a lot easier to press everything together. I'm going to press this bottom seam as a mirror to the top seam. So again, I'm pressing it so that way the seam allowance is underneath the 4-patch. On both sides. Alright, so we're going to set this one, the bottom row, to the side for a second. So what I'm doing is I'm laying right sides together, my top row with my middle row, and I'm just going to kind of bring these seams together until they lock in place, which should happen pretty easily because we press those seams in opposite directions. Now I'm going to go ahead and put a pin into this seam allowance. I'm going to bring it up a little bit so you can see a little better. It's really right where we're going to be sewing. So we'll sew, 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 stop with our needle down, remove the pin, and then keep on going. I'm going to do the same thing with this side here. So I've got everything pinned together the way it needs to be. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that right underneath the presser foot. I'm going to go ahead and sew along until I hit this seam allowance. And then I'm going to stop with my needle down, remove the pin, because now my needle is acting as a pin. It's holding everything together where it's supposed to be, and keep sewing. And I'm going to show you a close-up version of that in the second seam here. Alright, so I'm going ahead and I'm sewing along doing my 1/4 inch seam. And now that I've come up to my next seam allowance, I've stopped with my needle down, and now I'm going to remove the pin. I'm going to line up the corners of the end of my row, and now I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of the way down that row. It's a good time to check your joints. If you're not happy with anything, then you really just have to pick out like from here to here, repin and resew. I'm pretty happy with the way everything turned out here, so I'm going to leave that as is. And so now I'm going to go ahead and pin this other side. It looks a little better if you flip it around, I feel. So, same deal as before. We're just going to flip that right sides together. We're going to drag our seams together until they lock right in place, which should happen pretty easily because we press those seams in opposite directions, and stick your pin in. Do the same thing with the second seam. And get that pin in there as well. Alright, it's time to sew the second row together. I'm just sewing my 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going the exact same way I did before. I won't show this much detail in all the videos, but I wanted to make sure I shared exactly how to put together the entire block, including piecing it together as a 9 patch in the first one, just in case we have some beginner quilters on here, and this is their first block, and sewing a 9 patch together isn't necessarily second nature for them. So if you are new and you need to see a refresher on this in future videos, make sure you just fast forward to this point in the video when it comes time to put together the blocks from a 9 patch into a completed block. Alright, we have one last seam to press open here. So I'm going to go ahead and press it so that it's underneath the outside row, just like we did for that first one. And now we have our block. It's all finished. So that was pretty simple. We got our first block together for the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month using Northcott fabric Stonehenge Gradations. We used trapeze to make these 4 patches really fast and easy. And then we made some picket fence units and made those pretty simple as well. Make sure you get your pattern book, which is available through local quilt shops that stock Northcott fabrics, as well as at quiltaddictsanonymous.com. Thank you so much for following along in the Kaleidoscope Block of the Month. Please check out the other videos so that you know how to put together the rest of the blocks in this Block of the Month series. Thanks very much and happy quilting!